Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elected representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Geoff Dubrow.
Welcome to Politics and Public Finance. I'm Geoff Dubrow. I'm here in Zambia this week, in the capital, Lusaka. First trip out of the country in 2 years. And Maja Bosnic, welcome. About 2 months ago, we talked about doing an interview on gender budgeting, and it's taken all this time for me to catch up with you. We're working on a project together along with Katongo, Chileshe. Did I pronounce that properly?
Yes, you did.
Okay, I'm really glad to hear that. Welcome to you both. Maja, we wanted to start talking to you about gender budgeting, and then Katongo, I had the pleasure of meeting you this week, and you have just so much to offer in terms of your perspective. You're also from Zambia, if I understand, so it'd be very good to have you both here. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Maja, I'm going to start with you. So, you did a TED Talk on this subject. How cool is that? And tell us about it.
Yeah, well, I did. It was now in December in Palm Springs, and it was, I have to really honestly say, it was a very overwhelming experience. I mean, as many of us, I was watching TED Talks for many years, and I was always impressed by the short talks summarizing such a complex topics. But then when I myself was asked to do it, I first realized how hard it is to talk about, my topic was gender budgeting, and to condense it in 12 minutes and to be a spot on. But beyond that, I was really, really genuinely impressed by the people I met there. That was just, it was a very overwhelming experience, and it was a big production, and obviously I'm not used to that, even though this is also a big production. But,
yes, of course, and I just want to acknowledge
comparable.
No, but I actually want to acknowledge that you received, last time I checked the YouTube page, you have 25,000 people who have watched your production. I think we're getting close to that, but we're not quite there yet. So if you have any pointers, that would be very much appreciated.
Now it's 700,000.
700,000.
Exactly.
Unbelievable.
But it's not me, it's really the platform. And
is it really 700,000?
Yeah, it is 700,000. And but the point is, it's really not about the talk, it's more about the platform that is really like a megaphone. So it's very powerful, and I think it's really great that they are featuring many different subjects. So yeah.
So I'm going to have a performance metric that targets at 0.1%, 0.01%. So when you're at 700,000, I'll expect to be at 70, and we'll just keep moving up the number from there. So you mentioned in your presentation, you said in a lot of countries around the world we have a very solid legislative framework for gender equality. We have commitments. But then you said, when it comes to budget and finance, that's where the story evaporates. What did you mean by that?
Well, I meant exactly that. We have, in many countries around the world, including Zambia, we were discussing that, Katongo, just recently, we are indeed having stronger and stronger legislative framework. We are having international commitments. We are having strong policies, but we are weak on implementation, and we are especially weak when it comes to budgetary and fiscal decisions. We are not really used to assessing them for their gender impact, and they are very powerful policies. So they are actually having transformational potential, and that potential is not used if we don't include gender considerations there. So that was basically my reflection on why we really need to seriously reconsider the way we are working with fiscal and financial policies, and to make them work for all, so to make them gender responsive.
That's amazing. And you mentioned something like 80 countries in the world are working on gender budgeting, and you said, 80 countries, I think. Has the yardstick moved forward or backward in the last 10 to 15 years?
I think that's a tough question. We discussed just before this meeting, we were discussing what is the really situation of democracy in the world? What is the situation of human rights? We are seeing some countries moving forward, but then back. We are seeing agenda that is shifting one side and another. I would like to be maybe an optimist in the sense that also to say that gender budgeting is just one tool for gender mainstreaming, and we can't rely on gender budgeting to solve all our issues with human rights and gender equality. So it has to be part of the broader agenda. So when we are seeing this broader agenda going backwards, of course, our gender budgeting will have less of transformative potential. That said, I would think that the work on gender budgeting is still moving forward. And why is that? Because it's more and more being discussed at the forums where public finance is being discussed. And climate change budgeting and gender budgeting, these are these two new concepts, I would say, relatively new, but are very, very important to be part of these discussions. So we are seeing more of that. And in that sense, I really do. I'm an optimist, but then of course you get very disappointed when you have another policy that is just jeopardizing the whole work that we have done for many, many years.
And Katongo, you mentioned, I think we had a workshop the other day that we all facilitated, and one thing I found interesting, I said I always have to admit that we all come with biases, and we have to question them constantly. And one of the biases I had was I just assumed that gender budgeting and gender equality was a Western import, and you set me straight on that. Why don't you share with us your views on that? Where is the African base for gender responsive budgeting and gender equality?
I think in that sense, I'll start by talking about gender equality itself. So quite often it's assumed that it's a Western import, that it's coming from outside. But the easiest way to look at it is to understand first of all what inequality entails. So inequality entails that, for example, the majority of young girls and women will not go to school perhaps because of their gender, right? Inequality entails that men cannot talk about their emotions and therefore end up in crises. Inequality has resulted in people in health challenges for many people. So when you say equality is a Western concept, then what you're saying is inequality is an African concept, which is not the case, right? So it's so easy to get lost in the politics of what equality is, because we just we keep locking ourselves to equality is maybe trying to make women the same as men, and then we just get so lost in that. But there's need to go beyond thinking that way and to see what are the impacts. So the impacts are those things that I've said. And then secondly, what may be new to the African context is the language of gender, inequality, which is, of course, it's in English, so it's not African. But within our own context, we have principles like, for example, the principle of Ubuntu, right? Which is, of course, an African philosophy, which in Zambia we say Ubuntu, in other areas they say Ntu. And of course it's a complex concept that I can't define or compress in one. But with it, there are many principles. Among them, dignity, equality, fairness. So that's an African philosophy. It's indigenous to African context, as diverse as they are, right? So in that, yes, the language of gender equality is new, but the principles of gender equality have been with us for centuries. We have proverbs in Bemba, for example, which would tell you, like, for example, love. It's that you have to balance it across love and care. All those are African. So to say that that gender equality is a Western concept, then we have to probably re-examine that. Now, coming to gender budgeting, right? Zambia and, of course, African countries in general have quite a robust policy framework on gender equality itself, but also on gender responsive budgeting. For example, we have the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which was developed in Maputo. That was in 2000. That was in 2003, and of course it was brought into effect in 2005. So this one talks about a number of issues affecting women in Africa by Africans. So the conference in Maputo was chaired by Africans, right? It was driven by Africans, we have the AU, right, which has several the African Union, which has several gender policies that speak to issues of budgeting also. Within the Southern African Development Community, where Zambia is within Southern Africa, we have a protocol. We have a protocol on gender and development, and within that protocol, we see the mention of the importance of gender-responsive budgeting. At the same time, alongside that, we also have guidelines which were produced in 2014 on gender-responsive budgeting.
I think one of the things we saw in the workshop that we did was some of the participants were really concerned about how this trickles down to people in the village, because of course people in the village are not going to understand what a policy framework is, right? So why don't you give your example as just to complement what Katongo said?
Sure. Well, so my example was was reflecting on the subsidy that was given to and the subsidy for rural development. So the purpose was to develop agricultural area in Bosnia equitably. However, the beneficiaries of these funds were 90% men. And the problem was, in fact, that one of the requirements to get this subsidy was to show the land ownership certificate. That was in principle not really needed because this was a subsidy for rural development. So you need to recognize that there are also groups that do not own land and yet are working in the productive labor force there, and these are women. So this was one of the issue, and the second issue was that the data that we were using was not sex disaggregated at all. Another point of analysis showed that women didn't even know that these funds are available, that they can apply, because that was discussed at the forums that women traditionally do not participate in. So all of this was changed in the time, and it showed tremendous results. And not only that this, the percentage of women who would get funds increased, but the rural development was done in different way, because women would buy different kind of equipment. So men would buy the machines and the big machines, and women would buy a different kind of equipment. So we would really have equitable rural development. I really like this example, and I must say, when I was reading some comments to the talk, I was to some extent shocked, but I shouldn't be shocked. There were even comments such as, there is no such a thing as public money. Yet indeed there is the whole area of economics that is dealing with public funds, and these are of course the funds that are to be used to the benefit of the whole society and is collected through the taxes and fees, etc., etc. So for me this is one of the important examples, and what Katongo said, it's really, really important to recognize the different needs of different groups in different areas of the country.
That's really
and I think this is just and maybe just one point there, very short. I really think that when we are doing gender mainstreaming, if you wish, or gender budgeting guide, it really does help us to unwind all of the layers. You used I really like your example in the training recently. You said onion, to peel this onion and to really understand who are we targeting in case of gender budgeting with public funds, but when it comes with gender mainstreaming with everything else that we are doing. So
how can this be happening at the same time where the gender responsive budgeting agenda is going forward? It almost seems like a contradiction. Who wants to start with that?
Policies are driven by people. So it's the question is, what is the broader belief within the system? Of course, policies are going ahead, but what do individuals within the social context believe? Until that changes, we'll keep seeing this happen. But then also, a movement brings resistance in a way. So there might be also that aspect of resistance, perhaps. So it's really difficult to see perhaps what could be causing that, and it's a tricky one, I would say.
Maja, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's, first of all, we, again, right before this meeting, we discussed on what is really happening. Is democracy deteriorating? Yes, in some ways. We are, exactly as you said, we are seeing laws that are really shockingly backwards, I would say, that are being enacted, and then we are shocked by that. I don't think we should be shocked, because as you also rightfully say, we are moving ahead, but then we are sometimes losing these battles. Nevertheless, I would again be optimist, and I would again say that I think that systematic changes that we are trying to introduce globally, and when I'm now, who are we that we can of course talk about that? But I think that in a way, first of all, I think it's really, really very important that these. I'm now coming back to budget because this is my favorite topic. But the budgetary reforms, yeah, exactly. So the budgetary reforms around the world are moving to opening up the budget process, to demystifying it, to make it more inclusive, to make it more transparent. Of course, we are then seeing the system, and the budget is political instrument. So we are seeing that system being taken aback. But as long as we persist, as long as we raise these issues in the budgetary discussions, in the finance discussion, I think this is really very crucial. It is very crucial. But of course, one cannot be not disappointed when we see that there are surprising things that go backward.
Absolutely, and I agree with what you said about the action and reaction very much. So, but let's talk specifically about the objections that you see and you hear from people when you're talking about this topic. Why don't you start at the global level, and then you can start at perhaps you could contribute at the regional level here in Africa, and any other experience you want to share. What kind of objections you get, and how do you overcome them?
I think there is several layers of these objections and the reasons behind. Like the first one is coming from this marriage of budget and gender equality, and then in the essence of gender budgeting is full understanding and embracing of equality and gender equality principles. And as Katongo nicely said, this is still very, very personal, very value-based, very so the first obstacles that we are coming to are really this not misunderstanding, different positions when it comes to gender equality in the different societies. So this is the first thing that we need to get to a common ground. Then another thing that I'm facing a lot, because I work with finance experts and people working in finance, is okay, why are you now putting gender into this discussion? Then we have climate change, then whatnot. And my argument is, but of course you are putting gender in climate change because you are doing budgets for people and the planet. Why would you do your perfect budgets when you don't know who you are budgeting for and what will that do to the environment? So I think that is one type of resistance, because after all, finance systems are one of the most traditional ones, one of the most bureaucratic ones. It's where the money is, and it's where the structures are not really flexible to changes for a reason. But I am seeing that type of obstacle. So I mean, I think these are the two. And then the third one, before I go to Katongo, the third one lies in exactly what I said at the beginning. It's this putting together finance and gender experts that are not usually cooperating much. They are sometimes, I wouldn't say speak different languages, I don't like that phrasing, but they definitely work maybe in a different way, and they don't see their common spots. And for gender budgeting, you really do need to have that. You need to build this common understanding, demystify budgets, but at the same time bring the expertise of equality and gender issues in the budget discussion. So I think these are the three biggest obstacles.
That's really interesting. Katongo, what about yourself?
So I think going back to just what Maja has said, it's the individual value-based systems, right? And those perhaps come from the misunderstanding of what gender is, or what gender equality is. So the concept of gender equality has been politicized, rather than thinking about the consequences, like the fact that people are actually dying, the fact that women experience higher levels of morbidity, the fact that men's suicide rate is 4 times higher than that of women. Rather than looking at that, we are focusing on very trivial issues, right? Perhaps, or maybe we pick and choose areas that we actually don't agree with, and then we expand it all to maybe enhance our arguments. So one aspect comes from that, and perhaps the positive thing in this case is, once the concept of gender equality is explained, you start to see people's views change. Once they see that it's not, for example, a rebellion, or it's not an attempt to maybe bring one demographic down, particularly men. You start to see more positive views both from men and from women, because the resistance comes from both. The second part is the second aspect of resistance is with regards to prioritization, which Maja has actually talked about when she talked about placing gender practitioners in one room with finance practitioners, because there's the issue of there's the question of whether or not gender equality interventions are actually important, whether they should be prioritized, whether they should be at the top of the agenda, and partly that's because of there are blind spots within data, right? Of course, we have disaggregated data, we have gender disaggregated data in some cases, but in others we don't. So when there's a blind spot like that, it's difficult to see that perhaps one demographic is being disadvantaged. So there's that aspect also of the resistance.
Do you mind if I just comment on that?
Yes,
I think
yes.
that the work that I've been doing on PFM, public financial management, and with parliaments, I think you're right about the gender disaggregated data. That in many cases the response is anecdotal. Like I get a lot of I've seen a lot of pushback from political leaders, people who are usually quite civil and relaxed and outgoing, and when we start to talk about gender equality, there tends to be a real pushback, and often it's very much saying, we actually have a problem with our boys, not our girls. Boys are being inducted into gangs, for example, or there are more women in the public service. There are more women who are educated than men. So where are you getting this from? You're coming from the West and telling us, or you're coming from Canada or the United States and telling us this. But you're right that the data, the proof, the evidence-based decision-making really doesn't exist. But it's hard when, a country like mine, like Canada, we have updates all the time. I don't know if it's less than annual, but certainly annual updates on labor market force information that's sex-disaggregated. And then you look at some countries that have sex-disaggregated data, their census, every 10 years. How are you supposed to get to the truth?
Yeah. But there is also something that we have seen in Ukraine, where we've analyzed, and when I say we, it's Ukrainian government, that analyzed many budget programs, and we have actually seen that there is sex-disaggregated data, it's just not being used. Especially not used when it comes to budgetary decision making. It's some sort of administrative data that you collect, but you don't really use when it comes to decision making. It's not used. And then another issue that I'm seeing, sometimes we stop at collecting data, and that is equally, of course we need to have sex-disaggregated data, but we then need to make decisions based on the gap that we are seeing. And sometimes I would see a program in other countries that is considered to be gender responsive only because the ministry is collecting sex-disaggregated data. And these data is only showing gaps. So we are going through year, and we are seeing the same gap without any activities, objectives, and indicators that are following up. So I think sex-disaggregated statistics, gender data, very important, the first step, but we need to use what we already have, which sometimes we don't, and then B, follow up. Okay, this is now an indication that something is wrong, what is wrong, and continue with gender analysis and not stop there.
And it's interesting, I remember being because I think sometimes the objections, we can't assume they always come from men. I remember being in a Caribbean island in the Ministry of Finance, sitting at a round table, and gender equality and gender budgeting was mentioned, and the response from one of the women at the table, there was only women at the table, said, well, we don't have that problem here. And that was pretty much the end of that conversation.
I need to say that I was that woman, maybe I shouldn't say that at a public podcast, but I was that woman, because when I started working with gender equality and gender budgeting, I myself didn't see what the problems are. I was somehow I was unaware because I was not educated on them. And I remember my first meeting some 15 to 20 years ago, I don't know, with an expert that came to Bosnia to work on gender budgeting, and that was my first exposure to this topic. So I myself was not really aware of many gaps and many things that I myself need to learn. So I think this is also part of broader discussions on gender equality in your education system, in your work environment. This is not this is not something that we systematically educate ourselves about or are educated on. For example, you are teaching at university. This is so important that we are sensitized on these topics. So there is no surprise to me that you would sit and you would have, I wouldn't say ignorance, but you would have people who are not aware, including women. Why would we necessarily, I think it's really important to educate us all and to kind of, unwind the situations that we ourselves were facing but were not aware that they are part of our gender roles. So,
why don't you maybe close us off with your view about some of the biases that you've had to overcome in talking about this subject?
I think so. The first one is just the first one has maybe had to come from myself in a way, especially in speaking. So just maybe continuing from what Maya has just said. Quite often we speak from a position of our own privilege, right?
Exactly.
So it's difficult to see another person's struggle because perhaps you haven't experienced it. So the first bias that I've had to overcome is my own. To always know that when I'm in a room and I'm discussing issues about gender, I have to drop my own biases and just open my mind and check my privilege and what could be preventing me from seeing more. But the second one is what I've already mentioned, which is the broader social view or perception about what gender equality is, and particularly about people who advocate for gender equality, especially women. So it's just because there's a misunderstanding about what you stand for, right? Which sometimes creates some resistance in a room. But what I have realized is that even as a person who advocates, I also need to listen to people who are resisting. In Bemba, we have a proverb, which is "Uksende chinsendo kunko kokuna kidila," meaning when
we might need a translation for that.
Yes, I'm just about to translate. So let's say a chicken picks something that's yours, right? And you really want to get that thing. If you decide to chase it aggressively, you will never get the thing. In fact, what will happen is the chicken will probably swallow, okay? So what you can do is go to the chicken, approach it very softly, and then when you get very close to it, then grab it, right? So even in the same way, even with a topic like gender equality, which has much resistance, sometimes it's about finding the most strategic ways to get people's attention. Sometimes you might need a softer approach. Sometimes you might need a harder approach. So it's just seeing what can work in a specific context. So, for example, we are in a very Zambia is quite it's cultural, right? It's Christian. So sometimes it's understanding what is the value system in this context, respecting that value system, and then picking out from that value system what speaks to the issue of gender equality. And I found that quite often people are really open-minded to listening. In fact, when you break down what it is, what gender equality is, people come to think, oh, I actually have daughters. So if you mean inequality means my daughter could be abused while she's walking on the streets because perhaps she wore something short, then I do not want inequality. I do believe in equality. So it's just picking out those areas.
And I agree with you, actually. And I have 3 girls at home, and that's when I think that's part of what shapes my values and my desire to see the gender equality agenda going forward. Just in closing, I want to go back to something you said, Maya, which I think is very important, which I've never really had a chance to talk about. I think it's taboo to admit we had a bias. It's almost like we have to show that we're enlightened in a certain way. And to ever say that, geez, until 5 minutes ago I thought X, makes us look like we're one of the bad guys, one of the bad people. And I think until we're able to actually be open about that, it's going to make the dialogue very difficult. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having said that. In fact, I think it's a good thing that you did.
No, I think it's really very important. Yes, that we look inside ourselves. But I want to also add to what Katongo said. We are a lot trying to navigate how do we talk about gender equality, how do we pursue the struggle for gender equality. I am also a believer in making it mandatory, making some things, we are, especially when we are, for example, again, I will go back to our budget reforms. There are some things that just go without saying. This is the best international practice. That's why we have accrual accounting. That's why we have debt management that works in this way. That's why we
if
have.
If you're going to talk about accrual accounting, I'm going to have to get a glass of wine or something.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get into that. But you see, you wouldn't go and then convince accrual accounting is really. I know your values are really saying differently, but please let's. So I really, while I do think, of course, it's important that we convince and that we are coming from the honest place of understanding what we are working with, I really think at one point we really just need to make it mandatory. So knowing your gender equality, now I'm moving away from biases, I will get there, but knowing your gender equality and gender implications of your budgetary decision is part of your job. So it's not really what you believe in, and if you have daughters or boys, I have my two sons, and I want the equal world for them.
Absolutely.
So the thing is, it's really to make it entrenched in the systems as part of this is your job. And now and of course you come from different places, then you also have all sorts of discussions and education, etc., etc. And then when it comes to our own biases, of course, I think we are all, I will sound like Will Smith now, but we are all a work in progress in a sense, and we are all learning from our own work and from our own, and we do need, as Katongo also say, we need to look in ourselves and we need to understand the resistances, but we, I think, also need to get some things there in the system and not continuously just advocate and convince and try to go around at one point. And we are in the 21st century. I think we should be at the point where this is just the common sense.
Maja Bosnic and Katongo Chileshe, thank you so much. You've been listening to the Politics and Public Finance podcast this week out of Lusaka, Zambia. And this week produced with a special thanks to Sam Envoy and Stefan K Photography in Zambia, as well as by Huge Impact Marketing, which is also our sponsor. Please subscribe to the YouTube page, and we'll see you or listen to you or talk to you again in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.